Hey, brother, how you doing?
I'm doing all right, man. How about you?
Good. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Yeah. So welcome.
Thank you.
Let's see here. Uh, how's my volume? Is it okay?
Yeah, it's good. How's mine?
It sounds perfect.
Okay.
Excellent.
I've got
Um,
a I've got a mic volume control here so I can make it hotter or cooler if you need it.
no, it's excellent. It actually sounds really just the right level. You know what? One thing I learned from I think the last episode I did, I started getting a little relaxed and backing away from the microphone, and I
Uh-huh.
realized, hey, that doesn't work. With these kind of pro mics, you actually have to kind of talk into it.
Yeah.
As soon as, yeah.
I've got a distance figured out here for mine that seems to work pretty well. It's almost exactly 1 foot.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you using what kind of mic are you using? Is just the laptop mic, or do you have a special mic?
No, I have a special mic. It's an Insignia.
Okay. Wow. Great.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, thanks for coming on, brother. Brother Chuck Dunning. It's a real pleasure to finally get you on the show, and I know we've chatted about it. I tend to be pretty organic. It's hard for me these days with COVID and work and stuff to really nail down exact times and dates for people.
Right.
So I kind of play it by ear, and I've got a bunch of sort of standing invites. I just sort of message people and say, hey, would you like to come on the show? And yeah, let's make it happen. And then it happens when it's going to happen.
Yeah.
um and so here we are.
Here we are.
Yes.
Yeah, it's great.
Organic.
Yes.
So yeah, thanks a lot for coming on. And I guess how I like to usually start is to kind of learn a little bit more about the brother I'm talking to, and
Mhm.
on a more personal level, to get a sense of your background, like where you come from, your sort of a short biography of Chuck Dunning,
Yeah.
and how you got into Masonry, your sort of story.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, well, I guess Masonically, it starts with the fact that I grew up in a Masonic family. My dad was a Mason. My mother's father
Hmm.
was a Mason. And most of the men that I grew up around, we were an active church family. And so most of the men I grew up around who were leaders in the church were also members of the local lodge. And my dad had copies of Morals and Dogma and Lightfoot's Manual of the Lodge, which was the official Texas Monitor for a long time. And it had a series of esoteric commentaries in the back of it that were taken from notable Masonic authorities like Mackey and Pike and some of the others. And so just very early on, I had this uh, awareness that Freemasonry was something special, and it had this mystique about it. And because I was allowed to read these esoteric commentaries and the Morals and Dogma from the time that I was a kid,
Wow.
I was just enthralled with, what's this about? And oh my gosh, I can tell there's stuff here that's way over my head, but it's fascinating. And it instilled in me a love for comparative religion and mythology and just, all of these things from the ancient world that have made, the foundation of the modern world. And so that's kind of where all of my Masonic interests began. I mean, growing up, I was really involved in the outdoors. My father and I were always out hunting or fishing and doing something outdoors together. And so I developed a love for nature that way. Um, and decided that I was going to be a wildlife and fisheries scientist. And so I graduated from high school and went off to college to Texas A&M University to study wildlife and fisheries sciences, and just bombed out um, because I wasn't the person I thought I was. And that meant that I dropped out of college after my first year, and I didn't go back for 6 years. And during that 6 years, it was a pretty rough time. I didn't know who I was. I was really lost. I was struggling. Masonry was just kind of like way, way back
Mm.
in the shadows of the darkest corner in my closet, my mental closet at that time. And I just kind of settled on, okay, I've got to do something to make a living. And so I settled on being an electrician, and I became an electrician. And I was an electrical apprentice going through an apprenticeship program, and doing pretty well at that. Struggling in some ways because I wasn't really happy, but I was doing well in the apprenticeship program, and I had taken my first journeyman's exam and missed passing it by 1.5 points, and was about to take the second journeyman's exam when I had a serious back injury on the job, and that put me in the hospital. And I
Okay.
wound up having back surgery, and that forced me into a period of introspection and reflection on my life that I had never really done before.
Do you remember when that was approximately?
Yeah, I was in my mid-20s.
So what year are we talking about? Or
1985, I think, is when I
85?
had
Okay. So that
the
was
back
before
injury.
you got into masonry, or you
Yes.
joined officially.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. And because my back injury had been on the job, I was eligible to go to career counseling. The Texas Workforce Commission sent me to career counseling. They paid for it. And this was after my surgery. And I had a fantastic career counselor. And she really helped me examine myself in a way, do a process of introspection in a way that I had never done before.
Hmm.
And the result of it was that we figured out that I was really a very different person than I had been raised to think of myself as.
Oh, wow.
I grew up in a blue collar family. My parents owned an auto mechanic shop,
Right.
repair shop, and I grew up working in that shop. And so, I thought of myself as this just outdoorsy kind of, uh,
Regular guy.
yeah, stereotypical Texan in lots of
Sure.
ways, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
uh, and that wasn't really who I was at heart. Deep down inside, that wasn't really who I was. I still have a lot of those qualities, of course,
Sure.
and happily so. But what I really discovered through that process of introspection was that um, I felt called to serve others in a way that had to do with their psyches. I had this deep fascination with the human soul, the psyche,
Mm.
how it works, why we think what we think, why we make the decisions we make, what do we do with our emotions, all those kinds of things. And looking back on it in hindsight, I can see a connection with a lot of the things that fascinated me in the Masonic books that I
That's
was
right.
reading. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so I went back to college, Texas
Wow.
Rehabilitation.
After all that, you went back to college.
Yes, yes.
Wow. Wow.
The Texas Rehabilitation Commission paid to help me. So this was
Uh-huh.
our tax dollars at work.
Yeah.
And so I went back to college, majored in psychology, minored in philosophy, and I started making straight A's for the first
Oh
time
my God. Well,
since.
we have a lot in common in that sense. I actually went to undergrad and I majored in psychology and minored in philosophy.
Oh, you poor bastard.
I know, I just like you, right? Yeah, I almost had a double major in philosophy and psychology, but I was one class short in philosophy, so it
Uh-huh.
ended up being a minor. But I also had an interest in comparative religion at that time,
Yeah.
and my hobby in undergrad was actually studying mysticism and stuff. I went to
Yeah.
BU, and there was a kind of new age bookstore in Harvard Square that I go to every weekend and just
Oh, that's cool.
buy everything. I had a ravenous appetite for anything deep and mystical at the time. So that was like my hobby study. But in school, I focused on obviously psychology and then philosophy. But my interest in psychology was more in neuropsychology.
Hmm.
I really liked social psychology a lot. I loved it, but I wanted to get into research, and I was really fascinated by sort of neurochemistry in the brain and how it works.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, we do have a lot in common.
we do.
Uh, so all along, even during in those darkest years, I was still kind of pursuing an amateur study of
Mm.
mysticism and mythology and comparative religion. And then when I got into college, I was just fortunate enough to hook up with a philosophy professor who was into mysticism and esoteric traditions. and he taught a course called the Ancient Wisdom Traditions, which was really all about Western esotericism.
Mm,
And he was my first formal meditation teacher. I'd kind of dabbled in meditation prior to that
sure.
as a way to just, try to deal with all the anxiety and
Mm,
depression in my life.
mm.
And uh, and his name is John Miller. He and I are still really dear friends. I consider him to be the number one spiritual mentor of my
Oh,
life.
oh, awesome.
And and so in that course, we had to do a term project, and I had decided that I wanted to do a project on an initiatic tradition of some sort, a contemplative initiatic tradition. And I was just torn between Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism because my studies had given me a strong interest in both of those things, and I knew there was some interconnection. And
Oh,
so
sorry to interrupt you, Chuck. So were you a Mason at that time already or
still was
no?
not a
Still
Mason.
was
No.
not. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. All
I,
right.
w- I went to him and I told him about this conundrum that I had. Is it going to be Rosicrucianism or is it going to be Freemasonry?
Right.
So he asked me, well, do you have a family tradition, a family connection with either of these traditions? And I said, yeah, absolutely. I know I have one with Freemasonry. I don't know about one with Rosicrucianism. He said, oh, okay. And right at that point in our conversation, I looked above his head on the bookshelf behind him, right above his head
Mhm.
was the spine of Morals and Dogma.
Ah.
And I said, in fact, I grew up reading that book right there. And so
Yeah.
he turned around, grabbed Morals and Dogma, handed it to me and said, here's your term project. And so my term project was to read Morals and Dogma and a couple of other Masonic books, and do a report to him and to the class on
Wow.
Freemasonry as an initiatic tradition. And when that course was over is when I asked my dad for a petition.
Wow. So, I mean, you had been exposed to morals and dogma as a kid, but like you said, at that time, it was a lot of it was way over your head. I mean, it's over the head of most adults even today, right?
It's still, a lot of it's
Yeah,
still over my head.
yeah, sure. So, but that second reading, when you had to do your term project or whatever on morals and dogma, did it make more sense to you at that time in your life?
Oh
Did you
yeah.
understand a lot more of it?
Oh, a lot more of it.
Yeah.
And in fact, my teacher, although he was not a Mason, my professor really was very helpful because of his knowledge of the Western esoteric traditions,
Mm,
and which I think are valuable to help understand Freemasonry. I
right.
think one of the things I commonly say is that you don't need them in order to have a really deep and rich experience of Freemasonry, but they can be helpful. And so he was really good at helping me understand at a deeper level what it was about Freemasonry that was attractive to me, and some of the significance and the implications of things that I was reading in these Masonic books.
Fascinating. So
Yeah.
speaking of Masonic books, I know you've written at least one that I'm aware of, Contemplative Freemasonry. That's impacted a lot of brothers, and in a positive way. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that book. I don't want you to spend all your time on that book because I know you have another book coming out.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk about that book and then sort of your thought processes and how they evolved
Sure.
that led you to your new book. And then you could talk a little bit about what's coming.
Okay. Um, yeah. So the first book actually came about because one of the things that I had hoped to find when I finally did get into Freemasonry was I was looking for this contemplative initiatic experience. And not to fault my mother lodge at all, but I didn't really find what I had expected to find based upon the literature that I had been reading and the understanding that I had developed about what it was Freemasonry had to offer.
Right.
They did a really good job at performing ritual to the letter. But what they didn't have was a philosophical milieu, to use one of those fancy words that I would have
Right.
never used, at an earlier point in my life. They didn't have a rich philosophical atmosphere
Sure.
around that. They didn't have any sort of support or education or instruction in contemplative methods And so what I started doing was, as I was about being a Mason by actually being one, I was also doing the study of contemplative practice and contemplative traditions on the side, and finding ways to marry those with each other, with my professor, former professor now, as a guide, and another teacher that I connected with, and that's how the first book came to be. It initially just kind of started off as a set of notes on experiences that I had about putting together contemplative practices with the Masonic framework in different ways. And then I was part of an online study group or conversation group way back in the early days of online Masonry. And I said, I was talking about this approach, and people encouraged me to put it together in some sort of like a manual. And so I did, and it was published anonymously at mastermason.com for years. I put it out initially in 2000. So after 12 years of work, I finally
what
put it
was
out.
that? What was that manual called? What was
It
the
was
title?
it was called Contemplative Masonry.
Okay.
And then after, let's see, between 2000 and 2016, I became involved in the Guthrie Scottish Rite, Guthrie, Oklahoma, because of a friendship that had developed between Bob Davis and Jim Tresner and I. And Jim used to kind of nudge me from time to time, when are you going to publish that book? And he never would say Contemplative Masonry,
Right.
He was convinced that I had something to offer and that I had a responsibility to do it. And so finally in 2016, I said, okay, I'm going to take another look at that manual, see if I can do anything to improve it. And I found some ways to do so. And that's what led to me actually publishing it and putting my name to it, feeling like I had a sense of responsibility to do so.
Was it kind of an uphill battle to write an actual book? Because I've always thought about writing a book too, but part of me is intimidated by the process. I think, God, could I actually do it? It's going to be a lot of work, right? It's a lot of work. You got to be dedicated.
It is a lot of work, and you do have to be dedicated, and you kind of just have to be content. I have to be content. I know different writers have different experiences, but I have to be content to kind of let it take its own time.
Right.
If I try to create an artificial timeline for my writing, it actually interferes with the creative process for me.
Oh, like a set time every day you will write for 2 hours from 7 to 9 a.m.
Right.
That doesn't work for you.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
No.
Takes all the fun out, doesn't it?
Yeah, I guess that's part of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wrote that book, and it got lots of attention. I've got, I don't know, probably something in the neighborhood of 4,000 copies in distribution now.
Wow.
And led to a lot of speaking engagements. And as I was going around doing speaking engagements, people were saying, hey, we love this. We love the idea of solitary contemplative practice, which is the focus of that first book. But we really want something for group experience. And particularly when I would go to lodges or other Masonic organizations and lead group meditations, people would just be blown away and say, this is what I was looking for. This is part of what I wanted when I joined Masonry. And how can we get more of that? And that led to me beginning to conceive of a book that was based on group work for Freemasonry. And right about the time when I was really forming an idea of what that book would look like, I was also approached by the editors of a book called The Art and Science of Initiation, which was published by Lewis Masonic. And the editors are Jedediah French and Angel Millar. And they asked if I would be willing to contribute a chapter to this book about initiation that would look at it through a contemplative lens. And so I wrote a chapter for that book, and that book's been well received. And it really helped me also kind of clarify some of my thoughts about what I wanted to do with my next book. And so I wrote my second book which is entitled "The Contemplative Lodge: A Manual for Masons Doing Inner Work Together."
Hmm.
The publisher tells me that will be out this summer.
Oh,
We've
wow,
had
exciting.
Yeah, we've had some delays. I had been hoping that it would be out last summer or last fall, but there were some delays. Partly, one of them was due to a tornado that struck in the publisher's area, and so it looks like it's going to happen this summer, and maybe that's good timing given all this COVID stuff,
Right.
so that it'll be helpful to brothers when they get back to their lodges.
Interesting. So it sounds like your first book, Contemplative Masonry, was more focused on the individual Mason and how to integrate contemplative approaches or practices into their life and Freemasonry. And now the second book is taking it to the group level.
Yes, that's it.
Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah. And one of the
Okay.
things that I touch in there on is anytime you're doing group work, leadership is just something that naturally needs to happen. And so
Hmm.
I have a chapter devoted to what does contemplative leadership look like?
Wow.
What are the ethics? What are the skills? What are the roles that are involved in contemplative leadership? And so there's just a chapter entirely on that.
Well, that's
The
fascinating.
I think it,
Contemplative leadership.
yeah.
Wow. Wow. You got my interest.
Well, I think it'll prove interesting to a number
Yeah.
of people. The majority of the book is actually scripts that can be used by facilitators for a broad range, a comprehensive range of contemplative activities that can be done in Masonic settings.
Wow, that's excellent. Well, I'm sure a lot of people are looking forward to that book, including myself. And I guess it would be interesting to talk a little bit about what you mean by contemplative. Some brothers might not know exactly what you mean. They might think contemplate like means think about something, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So how do you, from your perspective, how do you define contemplative?
Yeah, that is a great question, Jeremy. And of course, I mean, in its most simple sense, that's exactly what it does mean. It is just to think about something, to just focus the mind on thinking about something in particular.
Hmm.
But kind of in the academic world, the term contemplation is an umbrella term. And it really has to do with, focusing the mind in lots of different ways to gain insight and understanding about whatever it is that you want
Hmm.
insight and understanding in. And it includes things like the practice of mindfulness, meditation. Of course, each one of these words, has its own kind of
Right.
need for explanation. Mindfulness, meditation, reflection, dialogue between people, conversation between people can actually be done in a contemplative manner, a focused manner to try to gain deeper insight and understanding. Um, and, um, and so that's what I'm talking about in
Hmm.
general.
I see.
Um,
But it's kind of a more thoughtful approach to masonry and kind of bringing a little bit of a kind of spirituality to our
Definitely,
Masonic work.
definitely, yes. The actual, the word contemplation, the primary Latin roots there are templum,
Hmm.
which is the same root as our word
Oh,
temple. It means
that's
it
right.
actually means a marked off space. And Mackey, our great Masonic scholar Albert Mackey, points back to its Roman origins and says that when the Roman augurs, these were the kind of like the priests and prophets of Roman religion at the time, when they were trying to get insight and understanding about something, well, they were astrologers. They would look into the heavens at the constellations or the planets that were associated with whatever it was they were meditating on, and they would mark off a space, create a templum in the heavens
Oh.
to watch to see what happened as a clue to how they should be thinking about whatever it was they were thinking about.
Hmm.
And that's where templum, the word templum in a religious sense, got started. And con, of course, is the Latin for with or within.
That's right.
And so contemplum was to be with or within the temple. And
Fascinating.
that's what it means to contemplate in its most ancient etymological sense.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So I'm some brothers might wonder, like, what does meditation, have to do with Masonry? And, some people have this notion that meditation is associated with Eastern religious practices like Buddhist. I'm not a Buddhist, I'm not speaking for myself, but I'm saying some brothers might say, I'm not a Buddhist, I'm a Christian. Why are we doing meditation? Or why would we discuss
Yeah.
meditation? And what's its relevant to a Freemason?
Yeah.
Its
Yeah.
relevance.
Yes. Boy, isn't that an important question? Because most Freemasons, myself included, um, have grown up in the Western world.
Yeah.
Our religious background I'm a Christian.
Hmm.
And I didn't grow up with any introduction to these things as part of my typical religious experience. However, I did grow up learning to pray and did a lot of prayer and did different kinds of prayer growing up. And prayer definitely fits within that or under that umbrella of contemplation. And in fact, if you go back to the earliest monastic traditions in Christianity, they talk about the practice of contemplation quite a lot.
Hmm.
Contemplation was a kind of prayer for them, but not the kind of prayer that we typically think of today. We Most of the time when people think about prayer today, they think about talking to God, about petitioning to God, telling God what we
Right.
want, or
Making our requests.
making our requests, apologizing for our wrongs,
Yes.
promising to do better, those kinds of things.
Yes.
Um, but those are not the only forms of prayer. And in these ancient Christian monastic traditions, one of the most powerful forms of prayer is just the prayer of silence, is just being still and silent and not trying to put any thoughts between us and God,
Mm.
to just be as open to the presence of the divine as possible right here, right now. And they would even talk about a thing called infused contemplation, so that when you're in that really quiet, wide open state of silent prayer, that sometimes something happens and you actually experience the touch of the divine. The divine responds to you, is one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is the divine is always touching you. You just don't experience it until you get all the other stuff out of the way.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've often struggled with prayer, and what exactly do I pray for? And in some sense, is me asking for something different than I already have in some way an insult to God, as if things aren't perfect, and
Yeah.
and God
Yeah.
in all His majesty hasn't created a perfect world full of blessings for me in every single moment.
Right.
And so me saying I want it different, or I need a change, God, in my external world is in a way an act of ingratitude in some
Yes.
sense. I mean, I'm making an extreme explanation here to make a point, I guess. And so that's where I see meditation having a real role, is really just calming our mind and all of its distractions and all of its needs and wants and
Yes.
and all of its criticism that we see of our world, and just trying to calm that and be more receptive to what is.
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. That deep inner sense of peace, um, the peace that passeth understanding, to use some
Yeah.
of our good New Testament Christian language. Um, yeah, that's an important thing. It's
Yeah.
also important to realize that we can't begin to see the world clearly and therefore know what we might really have to offer the world until we can accept it for the way it actually is,
Hmm.
without any of our own expectations and hopes and fears
Right.
interfering with that clear perception.
That's right. That's right. And it kind of reminds me of the story of the high priest walking across the checkerboard floor, sort of transcending the idea of duality in this world and the black and white, of good and evil. And how do we get beyond that? And it just harkens back to that whole question of, why is there evil in the world, and is there really evil? And from a higher perspective, from God's own
Yes,
perspective, yeah, it's just a fundamental tough question.
it
um
is.
have you resolved it?
It's
We need answers, Chuck. Come on,
Thanks,
man.
Jeremy. Thanks,
I know,
Jeremy.
right? Why is
Jeremy's
there evil in the world?
very, very kindly.
I
Here's
know.
the cliff, Chuck. Please walk
Yes,
off of it.
yes. There you go. Good luck. Maybe have a drink of water beforehand.
Yeah, exactly. I haven't resolved it. I think I have. I think I have a more mature relationship with the problem of evil than I did
Mm,
at earlier points in my life, and I hope that that will continue to develop. I mean, good and evil, and you alluded to the possibility of seeing this from a spiritual perspective, in which you don't see these necessarily as polar opposites that are continually clashing against each other, but rather that they are two forces that are part of a greater harmony. And
mm.
I think Freemasonry talks to us in lots of ways that kind of points in that direction, toward that kind of relationship with the problem of good and evil. Certainly the checkered pavement that you mentioned, I think is about that. My favorite degree in the Scottish Rite, the 18th degree, there's this beautiful part in there where they talk about there will be a time, when we come to see all of creation as a tapestry, a beautiful tapestry, and woven of both light and dark threads. And that if
Right.
we attempted to pull away the dark threads, then the beauty of the tapestry would be destroyed.
That's right.
And there's even in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Testament, I think it's in Isaiah, where God is represented as speaking for God's self and says, I create both good and evil. I create the darkness and form the light.
Mm, mm.
And so that, I think, is a glimpse of a moment that whatever it is that we conceive of as God, whatever it is that we think of as the most divine, ultimately has to be beyond all human conceptions of good and evil, because we tend to categorize those things in ways that are awfully convenient.
That's right. Yeah, and of course, it's probably one of the most difficult questions to really resolve is why is there evil in the world? And I think Masonry opens a door for us to see that from a broader perspective, which is great. But I probably, like you, have not completely wrapped my head around that. And obviously, there's one thing to say, good and evil, all make sense because, sometimes, for example, some evil of having to suffer or maybe get, lose a job or something plays a role in humbling you. That's somehow more understandable than trying to explain, well, why did this kid have to be caged up and sexually molested for 20 years? That's a lot harder to explain.
No
How is that?
kidding.
How does that make sense? And why
Right.
would God allow that? So that's where it gets more extreme. Cases are very difficult to explain. And I
Yes.
still haven't been able to find a philosophical reason for that.
No, I'm right there
Yeah,
with you.
yeah, it's tough.
Yeah.
So, but we've only got these little heads, and
We do.
yeah. And then there's the whole, if you get into Kabbalah and you talk about the Ein Sof and all that stuff, there's so much beyond our comprehension. So,
Yeah.
we're just trying. So anyway, yeah, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Academy of Reflection,
Yeah.
since we are reflecting right now. And what that is, maybe you can explain to folks listening, what is the Academy of Reflection? What's your role in it?
Yeah. The Academy of Reflection is a chartered organization for Scottish Rite Masons who are interested in contemplative practice connected with their Masonic experience. It's intended to be a school and a society for contemplative practice. So what we do is we were founded in the Valley of Guthrie. That's the academy is in the Valley of Guthrie in Oklahoma,
Mm-hmm.
and basically what it came out of was there was a group of us that would meditate, get together for meditation sessions during the reunion, group meditation sessions during the reunion, and so there was some talk about why shouldn't this be something that is supported and more widely known of and has some sort of like official recognition? And so I
Sure.
went to the Valley leadership, which eventually led to the leadership of the Orient of Oklahoma. And we got a charter from the SGIG,
Oh, wow.
the illustrious Joe Manning, to create this organization, which we did. It was chartered in September of 2012. We had our inaugural ceremony in January of 2013. And we've now got, I think, 4 academies in formation in California. We've
Mm-hmm.
we've got valleys all over the country that have expressed interest and are trying to kind of lay the foundation to get things going. But we've got a curriculum. It's entirely voluntary. You can be an associate or a member of the academy and not be doing the curriculum. But if you want it, it's there. And we have a certification process for instructors to help people go through the coursework, to lead group meditations. And so it really is both a society and a school of contemplative practice, but it's entirely Masonic. We don't reference other mystical traditions or spiritual traditions, philosophical traditions,
Right.
except as they're referenced by Scottish Rite itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. That makes sense. And there's no like initiations or anything that you're putting
There,
brothers through, or are there?
there is an induction ceremony.
Oh, wow.
If a
Okay.
person wants to become a full member, there's an induction ceremony. There are no fees, no dues. If there's something we want to do as a group that costs money, then we just take donations and we pay for it that way.
Oh, that's nice. I like
Yeah.
that. Wow. And and you guys became chartered. So what does it mean to be chartered? It's just
Well,
go ahead.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's just a formal recognition that you not only exist, but that you are sanctioned by, you are approved of by by the Scottish Rite itself, through the Orient of Oklahoma in this case, and now also through the Orient of California, because part of our chartering process says that you have to have the written permission of the SGIG for your Orient in order to be able to form an academy. And so it lends the same kind of status to the Academy of Reflection that exists for something like, say, the Knights of St. Andrew, which is a
Right.
wonderful organization. I mean, fantastic organization. And it's not then just like, a side degree, one of the old side degrees, for example. It's not just a non-Masonic club that happens to be open to Masons only.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually an official Masonic organization, and in the Academy's case, the very first of its kind.
Awesome. So now during COVID, are you guys doing anything online with the Academy of Reflection?
We do have a Facebook group for members and associates, and there's been some conversation in there. We're trying to ramp up what we offer. We may be doing some things that are open not only to Academy of Reflection members and associates, but also anybody else that wants to participate in them. So we're trying to lay the foundations for that.
Excellent. So what about the Masonic Legacy Society? What's that?
The Masonic Legacy. So one of the things that happened when the Academy of Reflection came to be is I would get contacted by brothers who say, well, that's great if you're a Scottish Rite Mason, but I'm a Blue Lodge guy. Or I am a Scottish Rite Mason, but why isn't there something like this for Blue Lodge guys? And so I had been thinking about that for a long time, and I knew other brothers were thinking about that time. And then, rather coincidentally, the universe works in funny ways sometimes, I was approached by a small group of brothers who wanted to get together in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago at the House of the Temple to talk about what are the needs in Masonic education right now, and what can we do to take advantage of this moment in history when Freemasonry is going through so much transition, when technology is providing so many new opportunities, when when there are so many things happening across the globe in terms of society and politics that definitely touch on Masonic values and principles, what could we be doing to take advantage of this kind of interconnection of events and so we all got together, and the group was primarily pulled together through the drive of past Grand Master Akram Elias of Washington, D.C.
Mm.
And he had developed a relationship with some brothers that are involved in the Fetzer Memorial Trust, which is essentially a funding organization for the development of spiritual and educational kinds of things, activities, and so on. And that led to this big meeting that happened in DC, and then a series of meetings. And really quickly, early on, we identified that one of the things that needed to happen was we needed to take deeper avenues of Masonic education, like philosophy, psychology, spirituality, those sorts of things, that needed to be there, but that if there wasn't a contemplative dimension to it, if there wasn't something that involved actually a shift in consciousness, so that we're using our minds in some way other than the ordinary ways that we all use our mind.
Right. So it's not just an intellectual exercise of reading a book, for example.
That's right. It's not just an intellectual exercise. That we had to bring all of that together. We had to find a way to bring all of that together. And we were motivated to do it in a way that we could provide a resource that was just freely available, that anybody could use, whether they were a Mason or not, no matter what jurisdiction they belonged to, that it was a truly universal Masonic document that provided a theory for why this kind of approach to Masonic education is important, as well as a structure for how to do it, a basic structure that anybody could do, that didn't require, learning about some great meditative tradition or something like that, but that was something very basic and simple that wouldn't be too foreign, that people would recognize. I mean, I do that sometimes already.
Yeah.
And
so you don't need to quote Buddhist scripture and such.
You don't. That's right. That's right. You don't have to. You don't have to. Enroll in transcendental meditation courses or anything.
Right.
Yeah. And so we created a couple of documents. One is called "Practicing the Art of Our Mysteries," and it describes the framework and process that I was just talking about. And then another one is called the Facilitator's Guide. And so if you start practicing this, and then you want to become a facilitator, to offer it to others, to lead a group in this, well, then there's this Facilitator Guide that talks about how to do that. And so in addition to those two documents now, we also offer trainings, and we've done 2 online trainings now for brothers that want to know more, not only more about the process and the framework, but also how to be facilitators. And so we provide a 2-day online training for becoming a facilitator in this process. And the brothers that are going through it just absolutely love it. They're helping us to spread it. This is, I have a lot of great hopes for what it can do. And one of the wonderful things about this too is it's completely voluntary. It's the Masonic Legacy Society is not an organization that's trying to tell lodges how to do their business differently.
Right.
It's not trying to push a vision for radical change in the way Masonry is done. It's just about saying, hey, here's this other additional practice that can really enrich our experience as Masons, and which our ritual tells us we should be doing. If we're really paying attention to our ritual, it tells us we should be working with Masonry in this kind of way. And so here's an opportunity to do it.
Right. It offers brothers a framework to enter into that richer dimension of Masonry,
Yes.
which I think is great. It's kind of a bridge for a lot of brethren that may have been seeking something like this and didn't quite know how to engage. So thank you so much for helping out on that front, brother.
Yeah.
It's a very important endeavor, I think. Um, why is it called? Why the word legacy in there? Why Masonic Legacy Society?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. And one is that we have received a legacy through Masonic ritual. We've received a legacy about what Masonry is and what its potentials are. And we want to honor that legacy.
Mm,
I mean, we look into the past at all of these great minds, these great souls that have been associated with Freemasonry throughout history. That's part of our legacy. And how are we honoring them today? Are we producing the same kinds of great souls today that we see in the past of Freemasonry?
mm,
And if we're not, why is that? And what can we do
right.
about it?
Excellent.
And yeah, so
I
that's
like
part
that.
of it. And the other part of it is that we have a responsibility to create a legacy for the future
Hmm.
of Freemasonry. Masons today are creating the future for whatever Masons 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40,
Mm.
50, 60, 100 years from now are going to be experiencing. How are we answering that responsibility?
Well, that's a perfect segue into a couple final questions that I want to dig in with you on.
Okay.
Um, um, you know, one of it the first question has to do with all the sort of information we're exposed to in today's information age. Online, you can find the good, the bad, the ugly, everything in between. Whatever you need, you can find. If you're searching for something to help out you with your confirmation bias, you can certainly find lots of
Hmm.
evidence and quotes for whatever it is you're trying to prove.
Yeah.
um, so how do we avoid not being vulnerable to conspiracy theories, false ones? I mean, I don't know, there could be some genuine ones out there, but and then I guess it wouldn't be conspiracies anymore, they'd be actual, like, facts or whatever. But
Yeah.
how do we avoid being vulnerable to just manipulation by all the media and the information and the biased information that's out there, particularly as Masons?
Yeah. Boy,
Tough one, huh?
it is a tough one.
Yeah.
So one of the things, of course, is I think it's important to develop some contemplative abilities here.
Voila.
We need to be able to practice critical self-examination.
Hmm.
This is vitally important, that we need to be able to clearly see our own thought processes, our
Hmm.
own emotional reactions,
Hmm.
and understand them as clearly as possible, and in a way that um, we may have to admit to ourselves is not as flattering as like it to be.
Right.
We may see things in ourselves that that aren't as bright and shining and brilliant and rational and loving.
Wait. Are you saying we're not all perfect ashlers?
We all have a perfect Ashlar within us somewhere.
Yeah, it's in there somewhere. It's buried, but it's in there.
Yeah, there's lots of chipping, right, that needs to be
Yes,
done to get to it.
exactly.
Chipping and chiseling, and that's really what this kind of contemplative practice is about. It really is about the chipping and chiseling to
Yep.
try to find that perfect Ashlar within ourselves. But of course, the thing is that we have to also keep in mind that we're human beings,
Yeah.
and the idea of perfection in some sort of idealistic way, if we think we're really getting close to that, then we need to think about the possibility of how might we be deluding ourselves.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think it's vitally important for us to be very aware of our own thought processes. We need to learn how to recognize logical
Mm,
fallacies, for example,
good one.
within ourselves as well as in other people. I know it's really easy once you start getting turned on to logical fallacies to be able to spot them in what other
Yeah,
people say and what other people write in their social media content and so on, and yet never see our own, you
that's right.
know.
That's right.
Um, and so that's part of it. Another thing is the development of ideological blinders. I think conspiracy, since we started with the idea of conspiracy theories often play right into the ideological blinders that people wear, that people voluntarily put on a lot of times. And what I mean by that is either through the way you've been raised and the society around you and the people you associate with have kind of programmed you to accept a certain way of thinking about things, or because you've examined possibilities and at some point in your life you've said, that particular perspective makes the most sense to me. Either one of those two things, you've kind of settled on something. Maybe it's a political perspective. Maybe you come to the point where you say, well, I think the libertarians have it right, and so I'm going to identify as a libertarian, or I think the progressives have it right, and I'm going to identify as a progressive, or whatever. This can also happen with religion too. But once you make that decision, or once you've accepted the program that's been given to you by society, then you've got a set of blinders on.
Right.
And anything that falls outside of what those blinders prescribe as right and true is automatically rejected without any really serious consideration. And anything that falls within those blinders is automatically accepted without any further thought or consideration. Or even if there is some further thought and consideration, it's just a token so that you can say you've done it, but not really.
That's right. Yeah, because it gets so bound up with your sense of identity at that point, and that's when all's lost.
Yes.
Yeah, it's dangerous. And I think with the psych background like you have and I have, I see a lot of similarities with schizophrenia. And that's sort of the slippery slope with some of these conspiracy theories. As you get kind of cuckoo, you get kind of crazy, where suddenly everything is going through this black hole of your filter, and everything is a sign of whatever your theory is. Everything in the world becomes a sign of that. And I remember working in mental health facility. It was what was it called? There's like in between, instead of taking someone right to a hospital in a straitjacket, there's these little homes, like halfway house type thing, where
residential.
Where it's to not panic the person, and because they're having a mental breakdown of some kind. I used to work there in the overnight shift, and I had multiple personalities. This trippy shit. And I had some multiple personalities coming in, 3 a.m, schizophrenics, people hallucinating, and I'd have to talk to them. I'd have to give them their meds. I'd have to show them the kitchen and stuff, and I'd have to stay awake all night, which was also a challenge because I was tired. And I'd usually watch TV, but sometimes they'd come out at like 3 a.m. with hallucinations and start talking to me about this stuff. And it was just me and them. And, these people, I mean, they start to construe everything that happens, like a sound they heard must be a gunshot, that's the CIA coming after them. And I'm like, no, I heard that sound too, but I really don't think that's a gunshot. I think that was just something else. But they start to construe all of reality. Everything now comes to build on this theory, this conspiracy theory they have. So I really think that there's a relationship to schizophrenia and people getting really lost in a conspiracy.
I think so too. And I think one of the things that is common to schizophrenia and this tendency that we see in conspiracy theories, and just with the acceptance and adherence to things like ideological blinders and groupthink and group loyalty and all those things, one of the reasons we're susceptible to those is because we're not comfortable with uncertainty, and we're not comfortable with complexity. Our world has much more uncertainty and much more complexity than most of us are willing to live with.
That's right.
And we think we need filters and structures, scaffolding.
We want to quickly simplify things. We want to quickly get an answer.
We do.
Make us feel better, calm down, like we have a sense there's order.
Right. Right. And just living with the unknown. The society pressures us to have answers.
Right.
And to take sides all the time. All the time.
That's right.
And if we don't, we risk being outcasts from anybody. We risk not being welcomed or having a sense of belonging with anybody if we sit in that place of uncertainty and say, okay, yeah,
That's a good point.
this is possible and this is possible and
Right.
this is possible. And I don't have a big enough brain or enough information to be able to say what
Huh.
the truth is.
Well, I think you made a good point that I never really thought of. Not only does, you know, having a set position on something or an ideological perspective give us a sense of identity when people, need that sense of security and an identity, like I am this, I am part of this group, but it also gives us an avenue for social bonding.
Yes.
I think that's what you were just pointing out, which I never really thought about. But yeah, you're right. It's hard when you don't have any set view or strong feelings in certain directions, and you're around a group of brothers who are all saying, yeah, this is the way it is, and you want to bond with them, so you join in and be like, yeah, I
Yes.
believe that too, I'm part of your group, I'm part of your group think, you
Yes.
know and so yeah, I think it is about getting comfortable with dissonance and complexity. I think that would be progress in today's world, and for us to realize how interconnected we all are, and all of these ideas are at the
Yeah.
end of the day, and there's a lot of nuance, and it's not so easy to um, paint a black and white picture of a situation. Just the world is so complex. There's so
Yes.
many dimensions to every problem. um, and so this brings me to my final point. I don't know if you saw, I posted a video on Esoteric Sundays page. Are you part of Esoteric Sundays? I think I
I
invited you to
am.
that.
I am part
Yeah.
of that.
Did you see
Yeah.
that video I recently posted on okay. So I
No,
posted a 5-minute video about how we as Masons can be sort of bridge makers in today's time where there's so much polarization,
yeah.
especially on the political front. I actually titled it sort of Masonry and Politics, this short video, which is a
Oh,
funny
wow.
title, which is a funny, controversial title. But of course, I didn't really talk about politics in any direct way, like, hey, I think you should vote this way or that way, or
Not
I'm
partisan.
I'm on the right or I'm on the left. No, but it was more about how can we as Masons especially bring peace and mutual understanding between people that seem to be on different sides of the spectrum,
Yes.
because I feel like this increasing polarization is causing a real growth in hatred to the other. And
Hmm.
I see that as a dangerous buildup that could lead to violence. And I've seen it in other
And
countries.
already has.
I know, and it already has. And so I
Yeah.
think as Masons, we want to de-escalate, and we want to find common ground, and we want to be sort of peacemakers and bridge builders, and help each other to appreciate at least the perspective of the other. At
Yeah.
least see where they're coming from makes a little sense.
Yes.
Just open a crack to how you might see, yeah, I kind of get their point. And I think that could help us to kind of calm down and see each other as brothers again. And I'm speaking more broadly across humanity now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on like how we can, as Masons, sort of bridge the divides that exist today.
Yeah. I think you've put your finger on a number of important elements there, and and I want to just address the term that you're using here of bridge builder.
Hmm.
So first of all, as Masons, our entire allegorical framework is about being builders. That's what we're supposed to be doing. We're not supposed to be destroyers.
Hmm.
We're also not supposed to be putting preservation above everything else. We're supposed to be building, looking for ways to build new, better, more beautiful, wiser, stronger social edifices,
Hmm.
moral edifices, spiritual edifices.
That's right.
And so I think keeping that in mind, like, all right, what are my guiding principles? What is it that I, as a Mason, I'm really here to do? Okay, I'm supposed to be a builder. How do I do that? And what are the kinds of structures that are needed in the world today? And of course, we're not talking about physical structures. We're talking about social structures, relationships. And so I think a lot of the work that we've been talking about up to this point, about self-examination, about being critical in our thinking, not only towards others but toward ourselves, I think all of those things are important. I think it's also important through the practice of contemplation and meditation, to recognize that this same raw, vulnerable humanity that I find in myself, that is overwhelmed by the complexity, that can be overwhelmed by the complexity and uncertainty of life, not only exists in me, but exists in every other human being.
Yeah.
That same hopeful, optimistic part of my humanity that envisions something bright and beautiful and shining for the world not only exists in me, but exists in every other human being. And so when we begin to recognize those deep, fundamental connections that we have with every other human being, it makes it a lot easier for us then to make the space, both externally and internally, to really listen to another human being, to hear what it is that they are fearing, to hear what it is that they're hoping for, to try to make connections between their fears and my fears, to try to make connections between their hopes and my hopes, and then to try to find ways that serve both of us. Not just one against the other, but that serve both of us. And to understand sometimes that serving the best interest of another person actually can be a good thing for me, even if on the surface it doesn't necessarily seem like it is good for me, you know? And so I think that's part of it. I think it's important for us to consider what, kind of going back to those fundamental principles, what is the most essential test for whether we're headed in the right direction with the decisions that we make and the things that we're trying to create in the world.
Right.
And Freemasonry has a very simple answer to that. But the answer is simple, but it leads to a lot of complexity. The simple answer in Masonry to that is charity. And we're not talking about charity in the sense of like,
I gave $10 to that poor guy down the street.
Exactly.
Done.
I'm supporting
done, right?
this. Yeah, I'm supporting the scholarship fund for the lodge.
Which is great stuff, but
it is. That's part of charity.
Yes.
But that is not all of charity.
That's right.
Charity, our concept of charity as a theological virtue, comes from the Greek agape, which is universal, unconditional love.
That's it.
And
it's the heart.
It is the heart. A dear friend of mine, Lorenzo Ramos, out in California, he's a licensed psychologist, just wrote an article in the Philalethes magazine. I'm looking at it right here, the latest issue of the Philalethes journal, called The Inmost Recesses of the Human Heart.
Right.
And he talks in that article about what do we mean when we say the heart. And I think a lot of us we use our gut and we use our head when we make decisions about what's right and what's wrong, and about what we will or will not help build, and about how we regard other human beings. But the heart is kind of put on the back seat. And it should be the first thing. Charity should.
I like that.
We talk about charity in Masonic language as the chief of every social virtue. The chief of every social virtue. That's right there in Daniel Sickles' Ahimon Rezon. And that means it should be the guide to all of the other virtues, how we use all of the other virtues.
That's amazing. I like that. So in a way, it should be our sort of criteria or our filter, particularly in public, and how we engage in the public sphere. I would say is, we should always consider our actions that we take in public. Is this going to increase compassion and love in our world? Is this action going to increase positivity, mutual respect, and mutual understanding and empathy, or not? And if it's not, we might want to think twice. Like, why am I doing this?
Yes.
If this is taking people down, or if this is perhaps increasing hatred, maybe it's not the best thing to be supporting.
Yeah.
I
agree. So the way I encapsulated that for myself years ago is to just ask myself when I'm unsure, when I'm recognizing my
Right.
uncertainty, to ask myself the question, what's the most loving thing to do?
Yep.
It's that simple.
Yes.
But boy, answering that question can be very, very hard.
Right, because it might not satisfy your emotion at the time, because
That's right.
especially if it's anger that you're feeling,
Yes,
you know what I mean?
exactly.
Because you want to do something hurtful at that moment, right? You
Right.
want to really
Or, or,
dig in.
or maybe what you're experiencing is distrust,
Mm,
and in the face of distrust, thinking about the most loving thing you can do can be really, really challenging.
yes. Absolutely. And just to clarify, I'm not speaking of any side here, whether it's right or left. I think both sides do it and can do it. Whether it's being divisive and increasing hatred and not doing something that would increase compassion and love in the world. Both sides do it. And
Yeah.
both sides also, I've seen both people on both sides also try to be bridge makers.
Yes.
And I think that we as Masons should lean towards Caritas
I
in,
agree.
in our actions and our behaviors. And so anyway, brother, this has been fabulous discussion with you. And you've really put me in a very contemplative mood today. I want to go have a talk with my son and have a cup of tea or something. This is
Nice.
great.
Nice.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciated the invitation, Jeremy. It's been a wonderful opportunity to share more with you, to find out how much more we have in common. I
We
had
have a lot in common.
that same job that you described about that
It's
overnight.
bizarre. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've done a lot of meditation in my past.
All right.
So yeah.
Yeah.
All right, brother. Well, let's continue the dialogue.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Let's do.
Thank you.
All right.
Peace.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.